about labor. Marina Sitrin has been an active in the Occupy movement worldwide. She's the editor of Horizontalism, Voices of Popular Power in Argentina, and author of Everyday Revolutions, Horizontalism and Autonomy in Argentina, forthcoming. She's a lawyer and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Globalization and Social Change at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's also a student, teacher, dreamer, and militant. Her books touch upon issues of state practices of co-optation and repression in relation to social movements, mobilizations to build autonomy and direct democracy. I give you Marina Sitrin.
Wow, it's really hard because I can't see people, but I've been seeing people all day who are part of Occupy, and that's just really fabulous. So it's like one coming together we're going to have all weekend. I just want to start actually with who has participated in some way in the Occupy movement. You were there, you stopped by, you wrote about it. Who believes that it changed things in society? Has it changed you? Right? This is part of what I'm going to get at and what I'm talking about. And the Yes magazine came out with a book that said this changes everything. And I think it's a really appropriate title. And what began as a moment has now turned to a movement. And we have the opportunity going into the spring and the future to not only deepen that movement, but I think to go beyond not only movements. So part of what I'm going to be talking about is taking ourselves seriously and pushing even further what is possible. Things like in Greece, out and through the movements, workers have taken over a hospital and are recuperating it and are going to run it themselves using assemblies. A newspaper as well. This is just in Greece. So one of the main things, I mean, so many people talk about the main thing the movement, the Occupy movement has done. Well, I think one of the main things we've done globally is make democracy a question. And not a question of, oh, we need more representative democracy and framing it in that way, but people seeing that more and more, that we can't have democracy with capitalism. And what... And so what we're doing is moving towards our creating what democracy can look like. It's still a question, and also moving beyond capitalism. So what I'm going to talk about is the Occupy movements and also a bit about my experience in Argentina and the autonomous social movements in Argentina. And I know it goes without saying, but I am speaking as Marina. I am not speaking for the Occupy movement. We are a movement. It is horizontal. It has so many different opinions in it, and that's the beauty of the movement. No one actually speaks for Occupy, having recently been quoted by Glenn Beck as saying, the Occupy movement is against capitalism. Marina is against capitalism. Lots of people in the movement have a lot of different opinions in relationship to this. Okay. So just as far as my personal participation in the Occupy movement, when I came to my first assembly in August in Tompkins Square Park, it was actually shocking. There were dozens and dozens of people, 60 or 70 people. I actually recognize some of you here. And what it looked like and felt like to me, having been involved in the global justice movement, is something like the assemblies we had in Seattle or in the Direct Action Network in New York. People sitting in a circle using these forms, the twinkling, the process points, all of the kind of tools of consensus building were very much in those initial days and weeks, seeming to me, feeling like the global justice movement. And then we occupied. And in those first days in Zuccotti Park, as we turned it into Liberty Plaza, it felt more and more like the images I'd seen from Spain and Greece of masses of people making decisions together in a plaza. And then as the weeks went on, it began to remind me more and more of Argentina post-2001. So that's that link I'm going to make. And common with all of these, Greece, Spain, Argentina, Occupy throughout the entire United States, is both the forms of organization that we're using and that it was a break. And this break is really important. There's this quote that I love by Walter Benjamin, and who would have figured that now he's being quoted all over on blogs, this quote in particular. It's a very interesting moment. But he said, Marx said that revolutions are the locomotive of world history. But perhaps things are very different. It may be that revolutions are the act by which the human race, traveling in the train, applies the emergency brake. And that, see, it resonates, but Walter Benjamin, who would have thought that Occupy movements and bloggers around the country are going to start talking about pulling the emergency brake? But it is that. It's that the movement's saying no, and stopping and freezing time. And that's the occupations all over around the world in saying that no and freezing time. The ya basta, going back to the Zapatistas in Chiapas in 1994, that ya basta, enough. The que se vayan todos in Argentina, that they all must go. And kifaya in Egypt, going back to before the occupation of Tahrir Square, this enough, this stop moment. And then in that stopping, it's not just a stop. It's not a stop that then makes a demand. It's a stop that then opens up something new. And in that new, it's the new that is the horizontal relationships that I'm going to talk more about, but these creating relationships with one another. It's not a thing. Horizontalidad, horizontalism, this is not a thing. It's a relationship that people create with one another, but trying to create new ways of hearing and being and seeing one another without having power over each other. And doing that in some kind of space, whether that's called territory but in some kind of physical space together where we can look to one another. And these are the same features that we also saw in Argentina and continue to see in many ways in Argentina, where in 2001, after years of horrible privatization, there was an economic crisis and an economic collapse. And the government's response to that crisis was seeing what had been done in the United States in the 1930s and fearing people would actually take their money out of the banks. They froze people's bank accounts. And in response to that and quite a few other things, there was what a lot of people in Argentina actually refer to as a rupture. There was this break. And in that break, people went out in the street. And they went out in the street banging pots and pans. It's called a cacerola. And people would describe this, thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people banging on pots and pans. It wasn't a movement of political parties. It wasn't a movement organized by the traditional trade unions or any of the political organizations. There were no party placards. What people went out and said with their bodies in moving, and then with words, was que se vayan todos, que no quede ni uno solo, which is that they all must go, not one should remain. And they actually did force out 4 consecutive governments. In that moment, and people being in the street together, then they also talk about finding each other and beginning to have this new meeting, like what we've been doing in the plazas all over the United States and what so many people have been doing even before around the world. Is finding one another, and in Argentina, what they started to call it was horizontalidad, which is where now when we use the language of horizontal and horizontalism, actually the first time I ever know of that language being used was in Argentina post-2001, and it was horizontalidad. And it was used in urban areas, in the different neighborhoods, in unemployed movements as people who had already been organizing in the later 90s, but were coming together and organizing to take over land, find different ways to survive in this horizontal way. Art collectives, media collectives, and workplaces more and more as they were getting recuperated were using forms of horizontalidad. And this relationship is this horizontal relationship that also has a different concept of power. That power is something that we create together. It's not about asking or demanding of a government or an institutional power of something, but creating it together. Sounding very familiar with the Occupy movements, right? And also talking about autonomy. So what we're doing and how we're doing it is creating a form of autonomy together. And one of the forms of doing and things that people were creating, they use the language of autogestión, which I still think is not, it's difficult to translate because while it means self-management and self-organization, in this context it also implies this horizontal social relationship. So people were using autogestión, self-organizing in this horizontal way by taking over land and growing crops and food and medicine and education. And one of the massive movements that also started were the workplace recuperations. And they are workplaces. This is, they're traditional factories, print shops, things like that, metal shops, but also hotels, medical clinics, schools, newspapers, all kinds of places of work. And the recuperations, not occupations, that the way it's talked about is taking something back. Most of these, now this started in 2001, and there are 300 plus recuperated workplaces now in Argentina. the vast majority using some form of, they all use some form of assemblies, the majority use some form of horizontalidad. And when they describe what they're doing, it's both complicated and also really simple. They borrowed the slogan of the landless movement in Brazil, occupy, resist, produce. I mean, I'm kind of doing this really short in a nutshell. It's a longer story, but they also will explain it, a lot of workers, as, yes, it's really scary and it's really complicated, and it's not really, because we know how to work. We work with each other, we form the assembly, we take back the workplace. The community, it's very popular, so people in neighborhoods and in the communities and other recuperated workplaces all help support this process of recuperation. And then they decide together what the priorities are of the workplace, and they've been running them and surviving. And those that have existed for a few years are actually doing better. And this is this interesting question, doing better. So monetarily, their salaries are better than they were. But what they talk about is kind of a different standard of how they're doing better. That measurement of doing better and being better is about how they're relating to one another, how they're relating to other workplaces, and what I think is actually a different kind of value that's being created. Now, of course, this is still under capitalism, and there are the rules of the capitalist market and everything else, but at the same time, the choices that are being made in a lot of these workplaces are choices about bartering with one another. There are choices all the time about showing solidarity with other recuperated workplaces. So while it might be the most economically efficient or productive to have workers working all the time, they make choices all the time to release workers to go show solidarity to other workplaces. Or in the afternoons and the evenings, they open up the workplaces for people to run clinics. People in the neighborhoods have clinics and computer programs. There are these bachilleratos now, which are alternative high school programs, where there are thousands and thousands of people who are getting their GED in a recuperated workplace with volunteers, many of whom used to be in the neighborhood assemblies, studying things like cooperativism. They decide together what they're going to study. So these workplaces are being used for many, many things. And this is just one of the kinds of experiences that I'm thinking about when I think how much more seriously we need to take ourselves and our movements, and thinking about it in terms of workplace recuperation. So the workers in Chicago recently reoccupied. They have, I think it's 80 more days, 70 more days to decide what they're going to do. And one of those options could be a recuperation. How popular would that be? And just imagining how many more possibilities we have kind of in these terms. So thinking much bigger as far as what's possible. I also, those of us in Occupy, hate this issue of money. It's become this really big problem. I think we should give it all to the workers in Chicago as they're making their decision whether or not they should recuperate their workplaces. Good. Let's bring that to the next assembly. So as kind of looking at the experience in Argentina now and in the past in our movements throughout the United States and all of the occupies, in Greece, in Spain, in Egypt, what we're experimenting with and creating are, in these new horizontal forms, new ways of being and producing together and creating ourselves anew in this process, and in it also creating a new dignity. There's so many lessons that we can learn, and we are learning, I think, from one another around the world now, but also we can learn historically, Argentina, questions about the state and the NGOs and co-optation and repression, and there's so much we have to learn, and we can learn all of this together. And in learning it, so that, again, being really serious, that we go beyond being a movement and go beyond capitalism.